Buddy. Got it. Okay. Got it. Oops. I just tried to click it off, but I think you might have to click it off. And so we're really trying to make a difference in New England, and that it's my mission that there should be a PWH everywhere in our country, in every state. And there are not PWHs in every state. And remember, this is happening everywhere. Every hospital, every nursing home, everywhere is throwing away stuff every day that has a second life and could be used. So here's this big, huge inventory. So you see all these boxes over here on the left. They come in by the pallet load. We probably take in 10 to 12 pallets, 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet tall a week, including bags and bags of medical supplies. And you can see here on the right, some of the things that would be collecting, the things that never even been used. Some things have been used, like a wheelchair and a walker, et cetera, or a pink basin that you might give a patient a bed bath with, but that stuff is all washed and can be used again. So, here we have the wheelchairs that are coming in. We have beds and EKG machines and exam tables and monitors and dialysis machines and defibrillators and operating room tables and EKG machines and centrifuges, et cetera, and all of the tubing that goes along with all these machines, the anesthesia machines and the tubing. We don't reuse tubing. When you disconnect a patient from an anesthesia machine with the tubing, that tubing is thrown away, but there's new tubing that has an expiration date on it. Plastic tubing doesn't expire. Does it expire? Of course it doesn't expire. So we just take it out of the package and then we repackage it and send it without an expiration date, which is really important to learn all these tricks of the trade here. And then we have the wheelchairs and the walkers and the crutches, and every container holds 50 pairs of walkers, 50 walkers, 50 pairs of crutches, EKG machine, a defibrillator, 20 beds and mattresses, 2 stretchers and a mattress, an ultrasound machine, cardiac monitors, and plus 1,000 boxes, 1,000 boxes of medical consumables that have been repackaged. So we evaluate and we sort and we pack, and it's a system that was set up by nurses. Nurses are pretty well organized people, as you know. They've got a lot of responsibility during the day. And we have this system in this place organized by nurses. And then here I am in the shipping center, and we repack everything, and we take this stuff and we ship it to countries in Africa and Asia. As I mentioned, 28,000 pounds saved from the dump, and the value of every container that goes out of our warehouses shipping center to Boston or New Jersey, where it's put on a big ship, is between $200,000 and $250,000 of medical supplies that were saved from the dump. So what happens? It gets all packed up into that container, which is 25 to 25,000 pounds. We pack it by hand. Takes 2.5 hours to pack 28,000 pounds in this container. I never knew, and you don't learn any of this, by the way, in nursing school. None of this is learned in nursing school. So this was one of the things you do learn in nursing school is 3 words, just figure it out. 3 words, figure it out. And so that's what I did. And so now we are we ship 1 to 2 containers out of the state of Maine, which is not a lot in my opinion, and it could be even more, but we would need more staff. And the other challenge right now that we're all feeling is the shipping crisis that's been going on now for about a year on both the East Coast and the West Coast. I'm sure you've seen all those pictures of the container ships that are lined up here on the Pacific and also on the Atlantic trying to get in, and then people trying to get their product out. So we're caught also in the middle of that. And it's because of Partners for World Health and the work that we do that we've had this unique opportunity to learn about human trafficking and developing a relationship with the brothel in Bangladesh. So, I grew up in Maine in a really privileged environment and never wanted for anything, had so much food, so much education, opportunities, and freedom. And never would I have imagined the struggles of those who have been trafficked for hundreds and hundreds of years throughout the world. And our work in the brothel in Bangladesh brought this to a head when I started to understand that what happens in Bangladesh actually happens in many different ways throughout our whole world, even in every state in our country. Human trafficking is an illegal trade of people for exploitation and commercial gain. And it is the form of modern day slavery. And on every day in our world, over 40 million people, men, women, and children, are victimized by human trafficking. Human trafficking is very profitable and lucrative business now with access, and it has access in every part of the world. So the global human trafficking rate has significantly risen in the past decade. In Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, they've earned a very bad name as a transit place for trafficking women and children. And poor and uneducated women and children are falling prey to these crime networks. And there are many forms of human trafficking. When we think of it, we think of sex exploitation of women, but there's forced labor, there's bonded labor, debt bondage among migrant laborers, involuntary domestic servitude, forced child labor, child soldiers, and just child sex trafficking in general. So it's a big issue. And who does it affect? It's a persistent global problem affecting millions of people. And it includes this forced and bondage labor, involuntary domestic servitude, and early forced marriages. And you may have heard recently what happened in Iran with the beheading of a 17-year-old girl. Have people heard of that? Just happened within the last week. And she was married off at 12 years old by a family and to an abusive husband. And she escaped for 2 years, and her father told her that she needed to come back. She came back, and the man beheaded her less than a week upon her return to Iran. And there's a video circulating throughout the world about what's still going on over there. And it could be many times girls are forced into prostitution at a truck stop, or a man is discovered in a restaurant working in the back of a restaurant, stripped of his passport and held against his will. So these are all forms of human trafficking, and they all experience the loss of freedom and choice. It occurs in all places, and of the 40 million trafficked, over 5.5 million are children that are trafficked worldwide. And this is a very lucrative business. $150 billion a year is resulted from the trafficking problem. It's bigger than Google, Starbucks, Nike, and the NFL combined. That's how much money is being generated. And when you can generate that kind of money, then you have human trafficking, because people are greedy and they want to make more money. And we, US, only spend about 124 million in fighting this. It's the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. So victims are everywhere. And the most common form of human trafficking is forced labor by the International Labor Organization, where around 25% of the victims of forced labor were living outside of their homes, countries, which showed that the big issue of migration and what happens in problems with displacement and war and violence. When you think of the displacement that's gone on with people from Syria, the people from Myanmar, you remember that over 1 million people left Myanmar because they were being killed, the Rohingyas, and they walked across the border into Bangladesh several years ago. They had to flee because they were going to be killed. And as a result, they often leave behind their families, and they leave without paperwork. They leave, and smugglers are promising them a job, and then they end up in forced labor, working in terrible living conditions and terrible work environment. And victims of the sex trafficking are everywhere, and they're not just here in the United States. The largest number, as you can see here from this map, is in Southeast Asia, with over 11 million people that are being trafficked. And most of the reasons for this relate to poverty, labor shortages, corruption, war, violent conflict, etc. These modern slaves are not held by chains like they were maybe back 200 years ago. They're held because of violent forces with psychological torture, beatings chronically all the time until they break down and end up doing what somebody else wants them to do, because there's no way for them to get out of it. These are shocking statistics for what's happening in our country. Over 40 million people, as I mentioned, are trafficked. 5.5 million are children. And the End Trafficking organization here in the United States says that out of those 5.5 million, there are 17,000 of those children are here in the United States being trafficked. These are children under the age of 18. And as you can see, 300,000 a year are underage girls that end up in the sex industry, and they end up having to have sex 15 times a day on average. So sex and poverty and sex work go along together. The special role of women in the developing world is sometimes forgotten, and women often have to walk for hours to get food and water to feed their families. And they are providers, teachers, farmers, housekeepers, and mothers as well. And they're doing all of this at once, but they're living in such an impoverished condition that they end up falling into the sex work. So it's a big issue when it comes to the fact that we need to do something about poverty and create job opportunities for women so that they don't end up in the sex industry. So the victims of trafficking are not just girls, but also women and girls, but also men and boys. So you can see here, most of it is for women and girls is sexual exploitation. It's the fastest growing criminal enterprise. And you can see here in the top with sexual exploitation that 96% of the problem is related to girls. But if you looked at forced labor, it's men and boys that are greatly trafficked in that arena. And also for men and boys, organs. They're captured and they go to the operating room and they take out a kidney, a little boy's kidney, and then they sell the kidney. And they could sell a lung, so that those individuals are organ removal. And that's 82% of men and boys are trafficked in that way. And of course, there are other forms of exploitation as well. Many countries have laws against the fully criminalized and decriminalize and legalize the sex trade in harmful ways. And the government involvement here is, this map shows the government action in various countries about human trafficking and modern slavery. And they have these tiers in about 177 countries. In tier 1, look at us, look at the green, look at Europe, look at Australia. We have significant laws in place to criminalize sexual exploitation and human trafficking. But if you go down the list and you come to the bright red areas in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in the Middle East, over on the right, just to the right of India, where Bangladesh is, and in those areas, and many places in Africa, like South Sudan and Congo, these are places that are on tier 3, and the governments are not doing anything about it. And it's just growing to become a huge, even more difficult problem. So when global poverty affects people of all ages and races and genders, one truth can be agreed on, that poverty disproportionately affects women. And researchers have claimed that 60% of the hungry people in our world are women. And that's probably true here in our own country. Women are often less, they are the ones that are 20% owning land. Most of them do not have that opportunity. And the education, the global education issue mirrors the statistics concerning poverty. And 2/3 of all of the 796 million people that are illiterate in our world are women. Education is the key to lifting individuals and families out of poverty and stimulates economic growth at the same time. And girls are systemically denied education more often than boys, resulting in more impoverished women in our world. So educating women reduces poverty and empowers them to act. So they do it in 4 ways: improving the health of mothers and babies. 1/3 of the girls in the developing world are married off before the ages of 18. And most have children within a few years. And most of these marriages are arranged. And this can be incredibly dangerous to more girls as they between the ages of 15 and 19, and they die from pregnancy complications more than anyone else. Educated women, however, tend to marry later. They tend to have babies at a later age. And in Egypt, the children of educated mothers are half as likely to die as mothers in other different parts of the world that are uneducated. So growing up without a mother increases the chances of living in poverty and living on the street. Educated people are also paid more because they can work in the environment and find a different job. And it reduces poverty by empowering them to seek more ambitious work. It also education halts the generation poverty, that whole circle of poverty, which is a cycle, and it's an unwanted gift that's handed down from generation to generation. And poor families tend to live near each other and create an impoverished community. And when parents are well educated, they tend to bring in more money, and then they send their kids to school. No woman, no mother wants to put their children out on the street to beg, or put their children in the sex industry because they have no other alternative choice. And even though we are women here in this country and mothers in the United States, it's the same. No mother, it doesn't matter whether they're from the US or they're from all over the world. They want the same thing for their children. They want food, they want shelter, they want safety at borders, and they want the lives of their children to be better than the life that they had. And women are more likely to remain in their communities, and education better equips them to give back to their communities. And so you see a big and major improvement in communities where women are educated. So PWH spent a lot of time in the Kandapara brothel in Tangail, which is about a 4-hour drive outside of Dhaka. And we first went there back in 2013 just to visit. And this is a group of nurses with the madams of the brothel. We had an opportunity to visit and meet these people, and they showed us around. There are 11 brothels in Bangladesh that are legal sex working establishments, and there are 7 madams in this particular brothel. And I asked them when we were there that day through interpreters, what is it that we could help you with? And they said, well, we would like healthcare services, because when they go to the local clinics or to the hospital, they're stigmatized and they're treated so disrespectfully. So the following year we came back, and we've been going every year and finished the last time in March of 2019, and provide primary healthcare services for the women and the children in the brothel. So the brothel is like a football field. And if this is across the street looking down on top of the brothel, it's a maze of small little pathways throughout this walled city, with metal roofs and metal corrugated siding in these little rooms that the sex workers have, which are about 12 feet by 12 feet wide, and where they have their bed and where they have their clothes and where they live, and they cook outside on the little walkway with coal for their food. And so the football size this is another photograph of the Tangail brothel. Bangladesh is one of the only Muslim countries in the world where prostitution is legal. And the Kandapara brothel is in this district of Tangail, and it's the oldest one, and the second oldest and the second largest in the country. It's existed for more than 150 years. It was demolished in 2015, but has been reestablished with the help of some of the local NGOs. The land that the brothel is owned by a local person, and he wanted to get rid of the sex workers because they were described as fallen people and bad people. And so he came in and within 24 hours evicted everybody, and they ran, could hardly take a lot of their possessions. And then they went to the court, and they were able, through the help of local NGOs, to come back in, because the court found that it was an illegal eviction. So the supporters of these brothels, however, believe the sex work is actually work, and that these women are working because they want to work. And reality is, if they had another choice, they would probably do something else. They demonstrated many times throughout the years, because back 20, 30 years ago, they used to have to go, when they went outside of the brothel, they couldn't wear shoes. And instead of wearing your sari on the left, they had to wear their sari on the right. so that they could be identified as sex workers. And this was a big issue, which continues today. They are allowed to wear shoes now outside of the brothel, and they can wear whatever they want. And that's because some of the very strong madams and the other people in the brothel fought for some of these freedoms. It's a place, the brothel is a place where it has its own rules and hierarchies of power, which are completely different from any mainstream society. For example, inside the brothels, the women are weak, but they're also very powerful. And the most vulnerable stage is when a young sex worker enters the brothel, and she's called a bonded girl. And they are usually between the ages of 12 or 14. They may have been trafficked early on when they were 4 or 5, or they may have been born in the brothel. But some of them, most of them are coming from poor families, and they end up being the victims of trafficking. They have no freedom and no rights, and they belong to a madam. And the madams keep all the money that they make, and because they have to pay off this debt, which can take 1 to 5 years to pay off. Once they paid off their debt, then they can refuse customers and they can keep most of their money, but then they have to pay for expenses in the brothel because it's not cheap to live there. So here is just there are many openings like this into the Tangail brothel where people can enter. And these are women that are sitting outside waiting for men to walk by so they can talk to them and possibly have an encounter during the day. And you'll also notice that these particular women are heavy. And one of the reasons why is that they start giving girls a drug called Orodex, which is a steroid that they give to cows to help stimulate growth of milk. And it causes women to girls to go into puberty and gain weight, and so that they would be more attractive in the sex industry. So accommodations in the brothel, this looks kind of nice, but it's very small. There's no bathroom. It's in a long alleyway with little rooms right next to each other. As I mentioned, the corrugated metal in the ceiling. And they each have one of these rooms. They have to pay for the electricity. They have to pay to rent the room, which is expensive when they might only be making $10 or $15 a day. So they have to use all of that money to pay a lot of these expenses, and pay for food, and if they unfortunately get pregnant, to pay to take care of children. So there are long rows of little aisles with these small rooms, and all the sex workers will remember the horror of taking their first client when they were children. First, there's torture to make the girls comply, and then the first encounter, and the girls are given, as I mentioned, this Orodex, so they end up being, gaining a lot of weight and a lot of other healthcare related issues in the future. Sex employees in Bangladesh are not treated like any normal resident in the country, and they have no freedom and no human rights. And in the past 10 years, these women could not go outside. Because every time they went outside, they were treated so disrespectfully. They live in difficult situations, and most of them are in sex work out of desperation, not choice. Some have been born in the brothel, and some have been trafficked in from India, from Nepal, even from Bangladesh, from Myanmar. The girls that are sold into the sex trade usually are from very poor families, and they're tricked with promises from different people that they will have a good job, especially the young girls. If they're sitting on a street and they don't have any food, and someone will say, well, I can give you some dinner, and they'll go with them and find out that they are now in the brothel. Many of them have no secure housing, and some of them have to live on the streets, and then they end up as well in the brothel. And they earn money, but they have no formal way of investing that money or saving that money. And many times there's a lot of violence and a lot of stuff that goes on. So inside the Tangail brothel, it's like a city within a city. And the narrow streets, there are food little kiosks and stalls and tea stores and street vendors, and spending time in the brothel and just sitting there and watching the culture unfold. It's like any other city, and it has its own rules and expectations. They're treated like dirt in broad daylight. They're treated like dirt in broad daylight. And because of their profession, they face hate and violence in everyday life. Even in the 21st century, talking about sex is still considered a taboo. And so it is not surprising that these sex workers are methodically ostracized by society. Sex workers carry this unbearable and unjust burden of social stigma around their necks all the time because they are considered dirty and loose women by society. And there are some NGOs that help out in the world, but not in the Tangail brothel. And so that's one reason why I decided to spend time in Tangail. Sex workers believe that sex is work, and that's what they do. It is a choice that they've had to make in order to help themselves survive as well as their families. And there are many challenges in the brothel. Children are born of sex workers in the brothel. And what do you do with that? There are young sex workers that are trafficked in, older women no longer working. How do you take care of older women that are 60 or 70 years old, that they've lived their whole life in the brothel? And what do you do for that? The elderly sex workers, the ones that are infirmed or disabled, and who takes care of them? And of course, all the expenses that it costs to take care of, to live in the brothel. So this is a story about Cynthia and her mother. And this little girl we met, when we met her was in 2014. This picture is from 2016. In 2014, she was a little girl and she came to our clinic, and the story from her mother was that the mother had been born in the brothel, and the mother grew up in the brothel and got pregnant and had a son. And usually what they do with the sons is that they send them out to go to school with hopes that the son will make money and help support his mother in her later years. However, the son was really angry at the mother when the mother told the son that she wanted to be pregnant again in hopes that she would have a baby girl. And so the boy was really quite angry with his mother, and she never ended up getting pregnant again. However, she went and bought this little girl when the baby was 2 weeks old, and was able to show me the birth certificate. And it was evident that the birth certificate was not listed the real parents of this child. So this little girl has been growing up with this woman and thinking that this woman is her actual biological mother. The eviction that I mentioned earlier happened in 2014, and they left the brothel, as did many of the other sex workers, and they moved about 100 miles away. And I heard through the grapevine that she's now selling chickens and Cynthia is going to school. However, that was back in like 2014 and 15 when they were evicted, and we haven't seen them since. So I'm not exactly sure what's happened with Cynthia. So this little girl, someone that I met in 2013, she was about 12 or 13 years old then. And she had stopped going to school she finished class 5. She did not know how to read or write. And she was born in the brothel as well. She became pregnant in 2017. And in 2018, I saw her with her little baby girl. As I mentioned, the boys go outside to school, but the girls will end up going to school initially, but then as the mothers become late 20s, early 30s, they look at these girls as the retirement package. Very difficult to break this cycle, and you want to really try to break that cycle before someone gets pregnant. So this is another story of 3 sisters. And the 3 sisters, I met them in 2017, 18, and saw them last in 2019. From the same mom, and their mother died of drug overdose, different fathers. The older one, which is pictured with me at 2019, was 27 years old. She looks a lot older to me than 27 years old. And the others are younger, and they've all started sex work when they were about 13 or 14 years old. And the older one wants to leave. And she would have left, but she doesn't want to leave her sisters behind. And the big issue is, where do you go when you don't know how to read or write, and you don't know you don't have any transportation, you don't have another vocation, you don't know what to do. So it's a real challenge. These 3 sisters and this lady, Asha, with the cell phone in her hand, and her aunt and her younger sister came to the brothel in about 2017. She speaks a little bit of English and she's educated, so she can read or write. And she wants out of the brothel. But for whatever her reason, with her story, she hasn't been able to leave. So the three sisters and Asha are very interested in a program that Partners for World Health was going to start in March of 2020 as a social enterprise in the brothel. So this is a very sad story. This is a mother and a daughter in 2013. The mother was born in the brothel, the daughter was born in the brothel, and the mother put the daughter into the sex work because there was no other option to raise any money for food, etc. And this girl became pregnant and she delivered her baby in the brothel, no midwife, no help, and she bled to death and died in the brothel. And then every year I take these pictures and I take the pictures back to the brothel the next year. And that's my way to find where all these people are. And I start showing people the photo as I'm walking through the brothel, and then people will take me to these young girls that I've been following for the last several years. And when I found out about this story in 2019, I was so incredibly sad because no, she didn't have to die, but she didn't want to go to the hospital, and that was the issue. You need to have trained midwives, and pregnant women in the developing world need to go to the hospital. It's the safest place. It's another story. This is a 22-year-old who was married at 17, and after a year, she had been being beaten by her husband, and she left her husband at 19 and tried to find a job on the street, in sewing or selling things on the street, but she couldn't. So she entered the brothel, and at 20 years old, and she became pregnant, and she delivered this baby. So when we met this girl and her child with a significant cleft palate, we were able to help them with an NGO, and that child, we fixed the cleft palate, and the child went back to live with this girl's parents that were about 100 miles away. The parents don't realize that she's in the brothel. They just realize that she has a job and she sends money home to help take care of the baby, but they don't realize that she's a sex worker. This is Shamali, and that's a picture I took of her in the brothel, and you can tell she's probably about 12 or 13 years old, going through puberty, and that's her mother next to her. And exactly why she was put in the brothel is because her mother wasn't attractive anymore to men, and this would be able to make more money. So this is the same girl on the left in Shamali, and on the right is that young girl that I showed you earlier that was pregnant and has her baby now. And that baby was about a year old, I think, in 2019. So it'll be interesting to see what's happened when we go back in March of 2022. So this is Shamali now. This is in 2015 and 2019. And now she's a successful sex worker. She's making money. She's a typical teenager. She's not interested in leaving the brothel. She doesn't know how to read or write. She doesn't want to go work in a garment factory, anything like this. And so she would not be a good choice for us to decide, why don't you come and live with us and learn a new profession, Shamali, because she'd end up back in the brothel. We need people that want to come out, that really want to make a big difference and take a right-hand turn in their life and move on. And so then what happens with all the sex workers that are elderly? To me, they really represent the saddest part of the brothel. These are women, many of whom were born in the brothel and never had the opportunity to leave. And now they are old and they cannot work. And they have the same challenges that our elderly have in many instances here in the United States. The same aches and pains and healthcare issues and poor eyesight, forgetfulness and limited food. But the big difference is that we have a government here that takes care of all of that. If you have a need in our country and you know somebody who can help you out, you can find those services. But in the brothel for the elderly, they lack all of that. And they rely on the help of others in the brothel. This is why if they do get pregnant, they want a female child so that that child can be the retirement package. This lady never had any children, and so she relies on whatever she can beg for inside the brothel. And every year I wonder if I'm going to see her again. This last picture was taken in 2019. So what is Partners for World Health going to do? And I decided, we started a Rising Up project, which is a social enterprise. And then we're in the beginning stages of creating this social enterprise to help the sex workers take a right-hand turn. We identified 5 sex workers in 2019 and over the years, but 5 committed sex workers in 2019 who are interested in making a change in their life and willing to leave. And we're going to create a recycling program of all of the saris that the rich people wear in Bangladesh, when they wear them 2 or 3 times and then they go and buy another one. So I want to collect all the recycled saris, the cotton and the silk. And we're going to develop items that out of this fabric that we can in turn sell to the Western world. We already have some partners with a Rotary group that I'm involved with in Bangladesh. And we're going to teach and train the sex workers how to make these particular items. And we've already written a small grant and obtained about $7,000 to start this. And we've written another one recently with an organization in Chicago that's interested in supporting us at around $20,000 a year. And that could do it. That's not a lot of money, but that could actually set this up. So why are we doing this? We're doing this so we can help those people that are caught in this system make a significant change in their life and empower these women who will work to empower other women as they succeed. They need a step up, and there's no way out of the brothel unless someone like Partners for World Health were to come in and help them out. And so what about the elderly? Well, this is part of the whole Rising Up project. And there's a little space in this brothel where you could build a U-shaped building. It's not going to be easy, nothing is, but 3 words, figure it out. And that's what we do here. And it's not a simple project, and it's going to take time, but that's what commitment is all about. And if you look at what PWH has done and has accomplished over time, the Rising Up project can become the same thing. So we're raising funds, as I mentioned, through grants. We're going to offer a place in this U-shaped building where the elderly workers will have a place that's safe for them to sleep in a little room. There'll be a clinic there, a healthcare environment for the sex workers where they can be treated like a primary care clinic, and also a place where children can go to be supervised many times by the elderly people that will be living there. And this way we can start educating some of those children and hopefully keep them in school, as well as having a safe place for the elderly people. We need funding, it's true. So if you ever want to be involved with Partners for World Health, that's something to think about when it comes to the Rising Up project. And so as I bring my story to an end, my life's course did not have a plan. And it has unfolded. And as it has unfolded, I have found that I have been inspired by the tragedies in our world that we never seem to be able to fix. And I am haunted sometimes by the world's indifference. I have traveled the world for over 30 years to places like the gutters in Sri Lanka and the mountains and hospitals in northern Pakistan, where the Afghani refugees have sought refuge, to Kolkata, where the lepers live on the street by the railroad track, and to the dumps of Cambodia and even war-torn Libya, and the slums of Bangladesh and the fields in Burundi, where women cut down trees for firewood and carry it on their backs for 5 miles home without any shoes on, and hospitals where people are so sick, lacking medication and dressing supplies to change wounds, not once a day, but once a week, to where you feel what it is like to have no hope. Travels where you see the destruction of life and malnutrition and sadness and filth and so much poverty and so much need. But it is not the deformities or the illnesses that you see. It's the broken hearts and the broken spirits, the lost souls of despair and disbelief that in people's eyes that life could ever be so bad. It is not easy to look into the eyes of people of no hope. But if we are to make a difference in our country and in our world, we need to do just that. Let them inspire us to get involved in making our world a better place. in which to live, and let them teach us about gratitude and what it is like to make a commitment to something greater than our own self-interest. We can all make a difference in our world and have a huge impact. And all we have to do is try. Thank you very much for letting me share my story.